We wanted to talk about some Christian nationalist worship stuff because I wrote a book on it, and you wrote a book, American Dominion, that has a chapter on it and some other
Mhm.
references throughout the book. So maybe to start us off, like what there were when you're dealing with American Dominion, there's a lot of things you could have written about. Why did you wanted to do a chapter on worship in particular?
Well, the chapter is about Sean Foyt. It's not about worship as so many of us understand it and how so many of us have engaged in worship throughout our lives. It's about the weaponization of worship to promote a Christian nationalist agenda. And what's so fascinating when I was doing the research for this, what I found is that there is a reason why Sean Foyt would say that his worship is a weapon and why he would take his worship rallies when he was doing his Let Us Worship tour, why he would take his worship rallies to these hot spots of racial unrest, particularly during the summer of 2020 and thereafter when there were the George Floyd protests. And it's because he really truly believes, I say really truly, he says that he believes that worship is an actual weapon that we use against our enemies. And so when I say that he's using worship as a weapon, I'm actually quoting him. I'm not critiquing him. I am quoting him. And if you go back to the Latter Rain Revival, which is the predecessor for what became the New Apostolic Reformation, there's this teaching that became embedded in it that it teaches that worship is a weapon, that this is the purpose of worship. It's to engage. Well, it's a purpose of worship. Worship is about communing with God. It's about expressing our love for God. It's about inviting and receiving the presence of God among us. But it's also a weapon that we are able to wield against our enemies. And then the real question is, okay, so who are these enemies that we are wielding our worship against? And if we can think about our own personal lives and the moments when worshiping God has been the most impactful, I can say from personal experience that it's in moments of crisis, like moments where I'm facing my own darkness and I'm using worship of God, choosing to worship God anyways, as a way of fighting back whatever darkness there is in my own life. And I'm not going to argue with anybody who is going to have a similar approach. Like, if you want to suggest that the enemy that we're using worship against is depression, if it's anxiety, if we're just choosing to praise God in the midst of a diagnosis that we would much rather have not received. But when we look at the ministry of Sean Foyt and what he's been doing since 2020, when he first launched his Let Us Worship tour, we find that he is turning people into the enemy and using worship as a weapon against people.
Yeah. One quick question, just a practical thing. Did you just hear the air conditioner come on? Because I'm in a hotel and it just unexpectedly come on.
I
You good?
didn't hear any kind of a glitch, but I was
Okay.
also kind of on a roll, so I'm
Yeah, yeah, you were.
not
So
sure how
no.
much I was paying attention, to be honest.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, you're fine. So yeah, it's interesting with the Sean Foyt thing because like one of the things he draws inspiration from a lot is he identifies with David in the Bible.
Mhm,
And so you get this character, and the reason why is because David was a politician, he was a king, and he was also a musician.
mhm.
And
And
so
he was
and it's
a
interesting,
military man.
yeah. So that kind of he kind of identifies as David, like his camp Elah is, or Elah, or whatever how you pronounce it, is his location in DC, that he's got a townhouse where he can fight spiritual warfare from. That was the that's from the David story. Um, but it's interesting because if you look at like David in the Bible, when he used his music, it calmed the anger of Saul.
That's a good
Whereas with
point.
Sean Foyt, it's drumming up anger.
Yeah, it seems like that's the point, is to generate these really tense emotions that are going to erupt, and doing it at particular moments when the eruption of those emotions is going to accomplish a particular goal. So, for example, when he had his Let Us Worship rally, the Kingdom to the Capital tour right before the 2024 election, and there were very real concerns that this was going to become another January 6th, a week before the election even happened. So, um, yeah, the timing of the events as well as the what seems like a very intentional effort to stir up our worst impulses. And the fact that he's using worship music to do it, I mean, so I had to make a long drive yesterday, not long. I was in the car for about 3 hours. And to prep for this conversation, I decided I'm gonna listen to some worship music. I'm gonna listen to some stuff from Bethel, from Hillsong, uh, even stuff from Rich Mullins that we're just gonna have a hard time calling controversial in any way. And what I kept thinking is, wow, if we're taking Jesus from this position of being king of the universe, like if we're going to be okay for a minute using this imagery of Jesus as king and like worship in that context, because not everybody is, and I just want to acknowledge and respect that. It feels like when we turn Jesus and worship, like if you think about America 250 and the way that we're seeing people worship Jesus as a way of promoting Christian nationalism, just seems like we just gave Jesus a really big demotion. And
Mhm.
I'm not really okay with that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like, you look at the Gospels, for example. I say I don't use the kingship language, personally, but I kind of, in my mind, put quotations marks like Jesus is king, you know? Because if you
Mhm.
look at the teaching in the Gospels, it's like the disciples are always worried about who's the one sitting next to the throne, who's the one with the highest power. And then you got Matthew 25 where Jesus says the king is he's telling the story of this king who considers his brothers and sisters to be the least of these in the empire. And so at that point, it's like the whole narrative is subverting human assumptions about empire and kingship. And
Mhm.
yet, what this modern worship movement is doing is it's so much about taking territory and power, and it sounds so much more like the disciples' concerns than like any kind of king who, his brother and sisters are in and among the least of these.
Yeah, and I wrote about that in my chapter on Sean Foy. Can you give me just a second to yeah, just a real quick paragraph, what I wrote in here. The imagery of Jesus as king above the king, Caesar, persecuting these early Christians, if we go back to the first century, would have been greatly encouraging for those who knew that any day they might be called upon to die for their faith. But what happens when that same imagery of Jesus as a conquering king fuels worship music not for people in a persecuted minority, but rather evangelicals whose apostles and prophets have front door access to the White House? What happens is Sean Foyt and his Let Us Worship tour. So that's
Yeah.
my book, American Opinion.
I I noted I actually wrote down
Um,
that paragraph. I thought that was really interesting. Because like if
yeah,
you
I
look at
spent when I
one of
was
the sorry, we're having a little connection issues.
you're
You go
good.
ahead.
Keep going.
I was gonna mention, so like in one of the things I talk about in my book is how the soundtrack of the empire is different than the soundtrack of the slaves. And so like, if you're the empire, what kind of songs are you gonna have? You're gonna have songs about conquering. You're gonna have songs about taking
Mhm,
territory. You're gonna have songs about
mhm,
power and authority. Whereas slaves are gonna have songs about liberation. They have very different concerns. They're gonna have songs about freedom.
mhm,
And like you look at in our context, for example, like the Civil War, a lot of the the songs of white congregations during that time was like, stand up for Jesus, you soldiers of the cross. From victory unto victory, his army shall he lead. Like these were songs that were sung in public. They're very much about conquering. A lot of you can even trace differences between songs that were sung by white Christians in the North and white Christians in the South about like knocking down rebellion and all this kind of stuff. Whereas like the slaves, they were singing under wash bins in secret, in
Mhm.
hiding, and they had to sing code songs. They had to sing in code. Like it's just it's very different. And when you look at this Christian nationalist worship movement, it sounds much more like the concerns of the empire than like the concerns of the slaves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to or a really good place to point out that tomorrow is Juneteenth, and maybe we should be thinking more about the liberation theology that is contained within these really powerful spirituals that slaves were singing.
And like you look at like two examples more recently. William Barber, he was arrested in the for worshiping in the Capitol building with a Jesus is a poor man's stole he was wearing, and he was praying for the poor. And then at the same time, that very same week, you got Josh Howerton being invited to worship at the White House and to take pictures with Trump's Tesla.
Well, that's a thing. That sounds like a thing that actually did happen in 2026.
Yeah.
So obviously you've done significantly more work on the weaponization of worship because I wrote a chapter about it, whereas you wrote a whole book about it. But I want to point out the role that Sean Foyt has in the America 250 celebrations, that it is a taxpayer funded role that he is playing to perform his worship music with in coordination with the White House to celebrate America 250.
Yeah, he wasn't though even though he wasn't on the main worship leader for the Chris Tomlin event, he has been in talks with the 250 team behind the scenes. They are doing US government sponsored revival services. I think they got one coming up on the at the Mount Rushmore. At least he announced they were going to be doing that. I haven't seen a follow-up on that yet.
Is Trump still trying to get his head put on Mount Rushmore?
I have no idea. Trump has a way of like not saying things and having other people say things for him, and then he acts surprised, like, "Oh, that wasn't my plan. That was something
But it
somebody
is a
else
good
came up with."
idea, isn't it?
Yeah, but I love it.
No.
I'll go along with it. Um, one thing I was gonna bring out in your chapter you talk about was, you mentioned Sean Foyt being at the Call DC event, which was an event in
Mhm.
2000, and it's interesting because also, like, he talks about how that inspired him, and, like, around that same time, there was an event from the group Passion and, called One Day, and they had, like, tens of thousands of these people there in the congregation, so to speak. And oftentimes we pay attention to the people on the stage, like the Sean Foyts, the Chris Tomlins, but we don't necessarily think about the people in the crowd. And a lot of times, the future Sean Foyts and the future Chris Tomlins are the current kids in the crowd.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so that one in 2000, was that before or after John Piper gave the Starfish talk? Was that before or after 2000?
Um, the Passion, I believe, it was 2000 or 2001. I can't remember exactly where it was in relation to the call, but it was right around that year, basically.
Yo, I John Piper, I know he gave his Starfish talk. It was to a group of college
Yeah,
students,
that was
and
that was the event.
it was the same one. That's the one where he
Yeah.
gave the Starfish talk.
Yep.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be surprising. You know what's so funny is when I went to youth camp when I was in high school, Chris Tomlin was the musical guest there. It's because wasn't, like, that famous yet.
Mhm.
Like, he was getting to be pretty famous at that point, and there was one day when I guess I gotten dehydrated or overheated, and one of the counselors had to put me on a golf cart and take me to the nurse's office, and Chris Tomlin was also on a golf cart, and she accidentally crashed into his golf cart and hit his knee, and we thought that was, like, the
Oh,
funniest thing
wow.
ever that we crashed into Chris Tomlin. And now that with everything that's going on, it's like, okay, that actually did happen, and he was, like, really cool about it. He's somebody that I
Mhm.
met when I was a teenager in this weird circumstance when I was at youth camp, and now he's performing at America 250. But so I told you yesterday I was just listening to all of these worship songs in my car, and one of them was God of the City, which is Chris Tomlin, and I just had this thought about what if we had this song, God of the City, in a completely different context? Like, what if instead of applying it because it's very easily applied to a Christian nationalist context, and I think you wrote about that in one of your articles about Chris Tomlin and how he kind of had the Christian nationalist impulse all along, we just didn't notice it. What if we applied that to a city like Belfast, where there is this history of brutal fighting between different Christian groups? And we used it like if a song like God of the City was to bring a message of reconciliation and healing and hope to a city that's been ravaged by war with two Christian groups attacking each other. And we're not saying one side wins and the other side loses, but that like, hey, we are all Christians here. We have our disagreements. And there I don't want to sound like I'm getting sentimental here, but there's a lot of Christians who do not like Christian nationalism. A lot of Christians
Mhm.
in America who feel like Christian nationalism has debased Christianity and debased America, and I'm one of them. And what if our worship songs could become a tool of reconciliation instead of a tool of weaponization and harm that the way they're currently being used?
Yeah, 'cause, like, sometimes taking the weapon metaphor literally, we often hear people talking about how the Bible gives the vision of turning, um, swords into plowshares and into gardening prunes. Like, I wonder what it would be like if the sword of worship could be turned into a plowshare,
I
into
would love that.
yeah.
I would love to see something like that. Um, I mean, I'm genuinely distressed at the way that worshiping God feels like taking a political side. That genuinely bothers me as a person. Uh, and as a Christian, I mean, it just bothers me so much that I can listen to music and analyze it, but actually allowing myself to participate in worship as an experience between myself and God does feel like I'm taking a political side in this particular moment. It bothers me to no end. And I would just love for us to be able to use worship as a tool of reconciliation rather than a tool of attacking the other side and demonizing people who are not like us.
And I feel like a big part of that's why it's so important, I think, to understand hierarchy because, like, if let's just say worship, if you wanna say worship is something about the presence of God, talking positively about the presence of God, like, I'm just trying to, like, make it as non-Christianese as we can. Like, if the king is in and among the least of these, that's his brothers and sisters, then there's going to be a presence of God in and among, one another. And I think when we look at worship, the moments that resonate with us the most, it's that in and among nature. It's the singing together, it's the breaking bread together.
Mhm.
Like, we feel a a presence in that togetherness that is rich, and yet it's when we start to then go, like, elevate up to this, like, king up here thing, and we start identifying up the hierarchy, that's when all of a sudden the sides come in, because if you don't submit to me and my idea of power, then therefore you're to be dehumanized and exiled.
Right, but Jesus said there's there's not a single verse in the Bible that says you have to ask Jesus into your heart in order to be saved. That's
Mhm.
completely made up. Okay, that's a complete, absolute, total fiction of contemporary evangelicalism. What Jesus does say is, "You come and inherit the kingdom because I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, and I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was naked and you clothed me." And then, his followers are going to reply, the sheep will reply, "When did we see you as any of these things? Like, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me." I mean, he's basically saying, I'm going to make a lot of people angry right now, but it really looks like if I'm going to take this text literally, if I'm going to be a biblical literalist for a second, it really looks like Jesus is saying, if you want to go to heaven, you better go to take care of the people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy. You better go identify with them because that's who I identify with.
And something that where you I think we see a lot that playing it out in modern worship is in the pronouns that are used, for example, because overwhelmingly modern worship uses first person pronouns. It's all about me, I. The storms are surrounding me. Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall higher than the mountains that I face. Um, you split the sea so I could walk right through it. Like, there's no we here. It's all like this. We're singing
It sounds
together.
like it's about me.
Yeah, it's like great if this is your diary, but we're like in a room singing songs together, and there's no we in here. So there's no communal confession. There's no, awareness of what we've created. And it's just it's a Western individualistic, mindset that is showing up in our lyrics.
Right. And I missed the part when the Bible was written about me.
Mhm.
And I missed the part when Jesus said that that's how we inherit eternal life is when the focus of our worship is on ourselves. But then, if we go back to somebody, if we talk about a lot of the origins of this modern worship music, we have to talk about Mike Bickle and what he did with First Kansas City Fellowship and then the International House of Prayer. And the way that the sexual assault and grooming of all of these young women, and I say young women very loosely because there were teenagers, like 14-year-old girl who was groomed and possibly assaulted by Mike Bickle. Um, that is intertwined with ministry. And when you have this approach to worship, that it is a tool that I'm using against other people, and the focus of it is on me, that is going to be an outcome. That might not be the only outcome, but there's so many people now when we start teasing apart the narrative around people like Mike Bickle or these other leaders like him who have recently fallen to these scandals, we have to realize that this was a byproduct. Like, this was not an accident. This was a this was built into the structure. And so much of his ministry was about worship.
Yeah, he talks a lot about, he would talk about building the greatest worship movement ever in history, and he said, he had 5 billionaires that were all going to give $1 billion to raise up worship leaders that would be able to be full-time musicians, and he said He said, "I'm not even talking about the main worship leader, I'm talking about, like, the violin player, and I've got 5 billionaires who are gonna fund this." And so all these teenagers who are hearing this stuff about, like, God's gonna save Israel once we start all worshiping 24/7, and we've got 5 billionaires wanting to fund this, it's gonna be the greatest thing ever. Like, of course they're gonna when they're thinking about the future of their lives, they're gonna sign up for this. There's gonna be a lot who do. But then they ended up having to raise support. They ended up having to do all the work themselves for free. There were no billionaires.
Yeah, and the apartments there were, like, covered in mold,
Yeah.
and they were having to fast for, like, days at a time. Um, really horrific conditions that people were gaslit into at the International House of Prayer. But this was, again, it was a natural outcome of this particular theology of worship. So, I think the point of this whole conversation is that, at least from where I'm sitting, is I want for worship to be an experience between me and God, and a lot of times an experience that I share with the people that I'm surrounded with, whether that's in church, what have you. But we the way that exists right now, the modern worship movement has created so many layers and so many theologies that are just so dangerous. Not only do they demote Jesus to a Christian nationalist mascot, but they like you're saying, they are identifying with at the wrong level of the hierarchy, trying to identify with the top instead of with the bottom, and creating these natural, like, these impulses that are a natural outcome of these theologies that do lead to abuse and manipulation of other people. And we're seeing that in all of these New Apostolic Reformation institutions, not just churches, but the International House of Prayer, not a church, but a NAR institution, and the fact that we're seeing this replicated at the US Capitol. Like, this should unnerve people.
Yeah. And there's when you value the presence of God on the underside of power, you realize and you start listening to those who have not had power, you'll start to learn of centuries of wisdom that they have developed on the underside of power that we have completely missed. And just one example that ties into what we've been talking about here is that first person personal pronoun I. When there's a lot of spirituals that the slaves sang that used the word I. But when they sang the word I, they didn't mean it in a Western individualistic way. They meant it as a way of declaring that they were humans and that they were to be valued as people. And for them, it was a communitarian word, and it was a expression of collective consciousness, Eileen Gunther calls it. And so for them, there was no difference between I and we, because you can't liberate yourself without liberating your neighbor, and you can't liberate your neighbor without liberating yourself. There's no wholeness of self apart from wholeness of neighbor. There's no wholeness of neighbor apart from wholeness of self. And I think, to me, like, where we can start to turn praise into plowshares is when we start valuing the perspectives of the least of these and finding the presence of God there in ways that we didn't hear when we were at the top of the empire.
Yeah, well, I wanna, read just a couple of sentences here from the conclusion of American Dominion, where I look at one of our most popular, hymns or praise songs, I'm not sure what you'd wanna call it, in American history, which is Kumbaya. Um, "Well, we down in trouble, Lord, come by here," the Gullah Geechee people of South Carolina sang. "Well, it's somebody sick, Lord, come by here." In other words, we've been kidnapped from our ancestral homes in Africa. We've been forced to toil for the white man and make him rich. We found our freedom in the Civil War and then lost it with the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow. God, if you do not act on our behalf, we cannot survive. While their tormentors were singing hymns of praise, the Gullah Geechee were pleading to God for their existence. Worship was not their weapon, it was their act of holy rebellion. of disrupting the status quo by calling God's attention to their plight, of calling God to their aid when they were being oppressed by people who were, in today's terms, dominionists.
Hmm. I love that. I think that's probably a good place to end this. I've got some other, stuff on the docket I gotta get to, but you wanna have the last word to close it, or
Um,
any final thoughts?
any final thoughts? I think I've about said everything that I feel like I need to just add something here about what's going on with the SBC. So maybe if we can just get back to pronouns for 1 second. The In addition to I, the masculine pronoun he, constantly being used in worship music, and obviously that's also reflected in our theology and continually being reflected in our politics. We see it with the Southern Baptist Convention. We see it with the movement that is gaining traction to not only disenfranchise women pastors, but disenfranchise women voters. So our worship actually does matter. Like there is a politics of worship. And I don't like that. But can we turn that can we turn our praise into plowshares? Use our worship as a means of bringing people together and reconciling across all of these divisions that we've created in the past few years instead of trying to enact a particular agenda that identifies at the top of the hierarchy instead of at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. There's so much potential here, and there's so much that we could reflect on. I don't wanna give up on the conversation, and I feel like there's so much possibilities here for bringing people together. So,
Mhm. All right. Well, hopefully your book helps to accomplish that when it comes out in September, right?
yep, September 29th.
And
Mine
until
is
his comes out, I have a whole chapter on the weaponization of worship in American Dominion.
Yep, and then mine is, this is a bookmark. It's not the book, it won't be this skinny. Weapons of Worship: How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism. So, well,
I'm
thanks for coming
really
on.
intrigued. It was
Yeah.
nice talking with you, Rick. You have a good one.
Yeah, definitely. You too. We'll see you later.
Alrighty.